Hi, Atom. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. So pleased to meet you.
Tell me, where are you and what can you see from your window?
I can see my neighborhood. I can see a lot of trees that are about to start blossoming, and the backyards of various houses. And yeah, and I'm doing this odd thing where I'm not looking at you because I'm looking at the camera, thinking that way you'll see my eyes. So
yes, I'm looking directly into your eyes.
I'm seeing the figure of your face. So yes.
And are you in Toronto or Victoria?
I'm in Toronto. Yes, I'd love to be in Victoria, but I'm not because they're enjoying full spring and it's still quite cold. It's quite cold here today.
Right. I'm sorry to hear that.
How about there? How are things?
We had a mini heat wave this week where everyone stripped off completely like they do in London the minute they see the sun. But now we're kind of drifting back into our usual grey, cold thing.
But there's so much aspiration and hope because the lockdown seems to have worked and you're opening up. I was just talking to a friend and they're saying that they're planning to open the cinemas and they're planning to open the restaurants and bars and we're going into an extreme lockdown here.
Yeah. I know, but I think it's been such a hard year in the UK to do with COVID that I haven't let my guard down yet, and I don't really believe the government schedule for reopening things, and they're constantly dishonest. So I'm happy, the minute the spring arrives, I think everyone starts to feel better, and it's fantastic that the case numbers are down, but I'm still wary of expecting too much normality, I think.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it. I mean, we're just sort of in this strange space with the vaccine that we got from you, AstraZeneca, where we're sort of now all confused, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I've had it jabbed into my arm.
Yes, you've been fused up.
But it's just so strange that you would think that the obvious thing is to look at the UK and just say, well,
they're okay.
I mean, they're okay, but there's so much hesitation and so much suspicion, and it's hard to know where it all comes from, right? But anyhow.
Those are two interesting words, hesitation and suspicion, that I think reappear. Those two emotions or responses reappear many times in your work.
Okay.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think people are constantly wondering why other people are asking them certain things, or they're wondering how they got into a situation or what to make of a situation. And yes, you're right. There is a lot of hesitation. People are very self-conscious at times, and they're treading lightly, trying to understand what would be the next step. What's the best way to move forward? So yes, there is hesitation.
Yeah,
and trying to surmise what someone else might be up to.
And is that suspicion or not quite suspicion?
I think suspicion. I think presupposes a degree of self-confidence because you know what it is that you're wary of. I think some of these characters are unsure of themselves as well, so they're suspicious of themselves very often as much as they are of someone else that they're engaging with. So and I think in some ways they've been unmoored from a sense of who they are, and they're trying to reconfigure themselves. So you're in many of the films, you're seeing that process. You're seeing those moments where characters are having to make major reevaluations of how they situate themselves in a family or in their culture or their society because of something that has suddenly become apparent to them. So I love that. I love that moment of processing it. And what's quite different from what you do with your books is that I think a writer has to describe what someone is thinking, but what a camera can do is just sort of rest on a face and really leave that up to the viewer. To try and understand what is going through someone's mind.
But we all interpret those faces so differently. And I think when I'm writing, I'm imagining this kind of film reel running through my mind that I'm almost transcribing. So I'm responding to those images in my own way. And when readers read that work, they might think that the character, who I think is behaving in a completely rational way, is being sentimental or, histrionic, all of these things. And I wonder how you manage that. Where do you draw the line between what you want the viewer to see and what you want to see yourself?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I do think, I was talking with my editor, who I work with on several films, all my films really, Susan, mm-hmm. and she was saying it's interesting how a writer can tell the reader that a character is lying. You can say this character lied, and in film you can't do that. There are many clear, obvious interpretations of an action which are actually left to the viewer to decide. And that's when doing an adaptation. I'm really aware of that. And so when you're working, let's say, with William Trevor, who's just such a beautiful writer and is so careful about the way that they characterize the characters. But there's this wonderful moment in Felicia's Journey, I remember, where he's describing a character who has had a psychic break in a way. And the way he does it is so masterful, but it couldn't translate to film at all. And so I do think that they're radically different mediums in terms of portraying not only the human response, but also the way the viewer's anticipation or projection is incorporated into the process of absorbing an image, especially of characters who are in motion. So like a still image, we understand it's capturing a split second, like just it's frozen,
and it's often very clear because of that. Yes.
So, when the face is in motion, we are aware of our own sense of time and when a response might be anticipated and what that might be. But we're also aware of how that's played with and withheld. Very interestingly in film, we have these two approaches. One is the master shot, where you have two characters in a shot together and they're playing it in real time. But then what is considered very often to be the more conventional approach, which is coverage, where you have separate angles on the two different faces intercutting. There's always that question when you're editing of, well, what if you withhold someone's response?
Yes.
To a provocative statement, then the viewer has to imagine what that might be. And very often I think that's a distinctly cinematic space. I don't think anything in literature quite does that, or perhaps in any other art form, where you're aware that there's a human being listening, but by withholding the face, you're generating a very unique tension.
Yes, and you're a filmmaker who loves faces, loves faces in motion, and to talk about The Sweet Hereafter for a little while, I watched it twice this week, once with very distorted audio and once with this real audio. And I watched the first one with the distorted audio late at night. So I was just staring at these faces with this garbled dialogue in the background and long periods of silence. And I loved it. And that's probably not what you want to hear, considering you put so much effort into the soundtrack and, the dialogue.
It's a bit like telling you that someone gave me a copy of your book, but the pages weren't printed. So I'm just looking at blank pages and I loved it. I loved what you did with the book.
But then I loved your own vision much more than that.
Thank God.
But what it did allow me to do was to take those eyes, Ian Holmes's eyes or Sarah Polley's eyes, their faces, the manipulation that people's expressions create in you. And I think that with the story of The Sweet Hereafter, of a community in shock and experiencing trauma, mass trauma, such as it is, I think it's very brave to focus on those individuals and to not try and grasp a wider story. This is an intimate story, one that's uncomfortable and doesn't make clear moral statements.
Well, I have to confess something to you, which is that many of those lingering shots in the original script, there was a lot of voiceover, and it was constructed around a letter that the Sarah Polley character was writing to the Ian Holm character long after the accident itself. And you can get, at the end of the film, there is a fragment of that letter when Ian Holm runs into the bus driver, and you hear Sarah's voice saying, as you see her, many years after, you wonder, and she says, well, the whole film was constructed on that letter at one point.
Wow, which doesn't really appear. No,
at all, because when we assembled it, we found that it was redundant, and it actually it didn't work in terms of the energy of the film. And of course, we had the Pied Piper, so the two, it was either one or the other, really, in terms of using this device. However, that meant that as we were shooting, there were a number of shots where the camera was moving very gradually onto Sarah's face, anticipating this letter. And so she was also thinking of this letter as we were shooting it. So it wasn't as though I was just saying, okay, the camera's moving here and you're reacting to this particular scene at this moment. She was reacting to it in a weird future conditional tense, I suppose. I mean, yeah.
That's incredible. And it's the ghost of something within the film.
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah. And so I was very thankful. And it's one of those gifts sometimes. Actually, I have to say that this is one of those films where the assembly is the version where it's the script. The editor really assembles it as it is per script. The assembly did not work at all. Right. And it was kind of a moment of shock. It happens actually in film quite often where you understand that the placement of scenes, especially in the type of film I'm doing, which is not conventionally structured, or where there's a layered approach to time, it's non-linear in a way. So there is a reconfiguration that has to happen during the editing process. And in this case, it was quite.
And it becomes another film.
Yeah. Oh, it definitely does. It definitely does in this case. So the first idea was rather perverse. It started with the accident, and it was kind of moving backwards from that moment, and that felt wrong as we were looking at the energy of the film. Right. So I don't know if that happens when you're writing a book. I mean, I don't think it does. I mean, I know that there's a whole process working with the editor, but I'm not sure if it's ever that radical.
I think it was quite radical for my first novel, where an important main character was killed off after the first chapter. And that was something that happened in the edit that I didn't anticipate. And I know of other writers.
Did you having to go back? Did you have to go back and rewrite substantially? Yes. Oh, I see. Right.
So she had to be removed from all of the scenes that she would have been in. And it became a different novel because the focus changes.
Huh. Mm-hmm. And that's in response to an editor's input, or is it as you look at the entire, how is that? Yeah, explain.
It began with the editor's input, which I rejected. And I said, that's not the book I'm writing. But I sat with it for a while, and you just develop this kind of creeping realization that they are right. And maybe, the editor in a literary sense and the editor in a film sense are two very different roles. But I do wonder what that process is like for you, that editing process of working with another person.
It's very different, you see, because as you're shooting a film, you are not thinking of the assembly at all. And actually, as you finish the shoot, there's a few days away, and you hopefully are just resting or reading something else or completely... and then you go to a screening and you're seeing it. And in my case, and I think a lot of filmmakers feel this, you have a very visceral response of when something doesn't work. It's actually
what does it feel like?
Shocking and horrifying. When you're younger, it's devastating because you feel abject failure. You feel that you have completely missed the mark, and it can be really, really traumatizing. So I'm not sure if a writer experiences that because you're never that removed from the process, so it's, and the energy of how a film, because as you're directing, you're always thinking of transitions, like you're trying to imagine in your mind how the editing might work, because you need to have the camera move a certain way, or you have to temper a performance because it's not being presented sequentially. So let's say with the Sweet Hereafter, the whole sense of where various characters in the community were in relationship to before the accident and after, we're not shooting it that way. We're shooting it, in a way that makes most sense for the schedule and the availability of the actors. So it's the director's job to say, okay, this is where we need this tone because this is where it's going to fit.
Yes.
But then you look at the assembly and you go, oh my God, that feels wrong. Or the performance isn't responding to the energy that's been built up. And it's not a question of, as a writer, where you can go back and you can rewrite. I mean, you cannot reshoot at that point.
No.
So it's quite horrifying when you understand that it's miscalculated. But then, and I don't think every film is like this. I think this is the product of these particular types of films that I'm making, where it's quite. The process remains quite organic. It's not fixed. It's not formulaic as such.
And this was the first. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah.
This was the first book that you adapted.
Yes, yes. So everything I'd done before that were original scripts, and perhaps the shock wasn't as apparent with with the 6 films I'd done before. And this one, it was clear that there was a problem in the first assembly.
That must have been a big trauma.
Well, it was a trauma for 2 reasons. First of all, when I gave this script to Russell Banks, the writer, he had a very visceral response against the inclusion of the Pied Piper, the Robert Hamlin poem, which isn't in the book. And he felt it was far too literary a device. And he said, this isn't going to work. So I was convinced it would. But in the first assembly, it decidedly did not work because of this the wrong placement of it, and the fact that it was fighting with her voiceover, fighting with her letter.
Yes.
And the other issue is this major departure from the book in terms of the treatment of Nicole. Nicole in Russell's book is an angry young woman who understands the father's abuse against her and is very vindictive from the very beginning. Wants to somehow punish the father. And in the adaptation, I took a decidedly different approach, and we really see that she's kind of lost in the abuse. She doesn't really understand the nature of the violence against her. Maybe the father doesn't completely understand either. The lines have become completely blurred, and that love has become something where she wouldn't understand how she's been made a victim until much later, perhaps. Yeah.
Why did that feel more psychologically true, if that's the case for you?
Because it was more personal to me. So I as a younger man, I was obsessed with this young woman in Victoria, in the town I was raised in on the west coast of Canada, and her father was a very well known painter in the city, and she was being sexually abused by the father, and in a way the whole community knew, because the father was a well-known painter. He exhibited these very eroticized portraits of her, and very often he was in the actual paintings. Like, it was really odd because no one wanted to talk about it at the time, and she was certainly in denial. And we would go out on these dates, but first of all, it was always so odd. Like, the whole relationship was colored by this trauma that she hadn't come to terms with. And so that when I read his book, I thought this was a wonderful way to deal with this, because I didn't know how to otherwise. I touched on it with Exotica. It's certainly in the previous film, but this just felt a way of addressing it more directly.
And can we talk about that communal silence a bit? I find it very believable that everyone knew and didn't say anything, but I also find it so cruel and objectionable that could be the communal response to something like that.
It is, because now, it's inconceivable that would happen now. I think at that time, this is really, I mean, again, I'm older than you, and so this is the 60s, 70s, I suppose, and it just wasn't really something people talked about, and certainly, looking back, this is what's fascinating to me. Looking back at that, at the place I was raised, at the time I was raised, I don't quite know how it might have been any different than what it was. Because there was so many abuses of power, and I was struggling to come to terms with my own place in that very homogenous society. I mean, I was something of an outsider, so it wasn't my place to speak up, and so that would be an interesting film, wouldn't it? But I can't imagine that I would have ever have done that. That I would have gone to one of these art exhibitions and said, this is wrong. Yeah, denounced it, because the problem is that she was also under the spell, right? She wasn't really. He had actually equipped her to deal with it, and it wasn't. And this is what I tried to show in the film. It wasn't sort of a violent abuse. It was this blurring and this creepy, almost lyrical version of a love that had sort of. It's very difficult to describe.
Across the boundary somehow.
Yeah, they had created this bubble around themselves, and he was the master of it. And she was under this spell. And it wasn't until she broke free of him that she was able to understand how damaged she was. And I did,
was there no mother in the situation?
Yes, but she was also not going to, she to this day probably wouldn't acknowledge what has happened. So different times, right? And that's the horror of what many victims of abuse have had to deal with, is that they they look back probably and they still wouldn't be able to understand how things might have been any different, because there isn't that place they could have gone that would have understood and protected and honored them. And as long as a victim is supporting the artist, there seems to be a sanctioning. But I think that this is also, obviously we're in a time now where that wouldn't be, one couldn't get away with that for a moment now, thankfully.
Do you think?
I think so. I would hope so. Don't you think we're in this moment where that type of that mythology around an artist's ability to challenge society, the lines are obviously drawn when someone else is being victimized. Like I think that, and collectively as a society, we've come to understand that. I mean, it's not tolerable. I think that there are human rights issues, right? So an artist is not. I mean, I think this came up also. Do you know about the Vienna Action School? Otto Mueller. There's this movement of. It's an experimental film movement, and he created this commune and very radical work. This is in the 70s in Austria, and so there was children were involved in that as well, and it emerged that there was sort of this legacy of abuse. And again, I think anyone in our moment would find that absolutely horrifying.
Yes, I've got issues with Pasolini and his work in East Africa. With 1001 Nights?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Where I can't, for the life of me, understand how he was able to get some of these local actors to do what they did on camera. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it's still considered, a masterpiece or, a wonderful film without people really considering the role or without considering the power dynamics around what he was doing and where and when.
Yeah, there's a whole colonial history of Italy in Africa, right? And in
Eritrea.
Yeah, and so this all comes into it, right? And so again, there's a sanctioning, I think, that is allowed because of a certain mythology around the artist at that particular time, and the very fact that they wouldn't be able to do that now, I think. I think those questions need to be raised. I mean, so we can see something within the context of its time. But I will say, look, I'll tell you something interesting about The Sweet Hereafter as well. Is that in the 90s there was the use of incest had become something of a cliche as well, right? I mean, in a lot of 90s literature, I would say Sweet Hereafter actually came. There was a bit of that. When I read it as well, and the way the abuse was chronicled fell within a certain cliche, and I felt that I could give myself permission to explore it, and to explore this this circumstance I had observed using Russell's story, and I think using my feelings of the cliche and that allowing me to explore something which I haven't seen before, which is how a victim would actually understand what was happening, understand or justify or explain to themselves the abuse, and to also chronicle that moment when they understand the parents' fear. Like after the accident, we can see that her father feels that somehow there's this divine punishment, that a reckoning of sorts. And when the daughter, Sarah's character, sees that, she begins to understand that the father was abusing her. And at that point, we begin to understand a shift in her attitude. It goes back to what you were saying before. It's not a suspicion. It's a reckoning, a moment of reckoning that we are witness to.
Yes. That's really good. We talked at the beginning about hesitancy and suspicion. And I guess people who have experienced trauma feel both of those constantly. Mm-hmm. They're uncertain of themselves, uncertain of their own feelings, their own responses to things, and also suspicious of the people around them. And I wanted to just talk in a bit more detail about the process of translation for turning what you had selected. You optioned The Sweet Hereafter actively out of all of the different novels you could have decided to work on. So how much freedom did you give yourself with the material, the raw material?
A lot, because the book had been optioned by a Hollywood studio, and it wasn't getting made. And so when I approached Russell, I said, "Look, what I can offer you, I can't offer you what the studio might be able to offer, but I can promise you that I can make this film using the system that I knew, where I was in my career at that point, and that I would have complete." Yeah, independent.
How much involvement did Russell want?
He didn't want involvement, but I always I welcomed his input, but I also had to be very as I said, he was adamantly opposed to the use of the Pied Piper, and so I was quite confident about that, and so I think I said something to the effect of, well, if it doesn't work, we can always cut it out. But it was really clear at a certain point that it couldn't be extracted from the film. It was actually shot with that in mind. So, and when it came to the Nicole, I do remember talking with him about what I wanted to do with that character. Have her play music with the father, and that there be this whole culture, this artistic space, this creative space that the father was allowing her to explore, and in a way inviting her into. That was very personal to me. That I could see how that could allow a young child to become confused, and boundaries were blurred much easier than they were in the abuse chronicled in the book, which was really quite violent. She was a cheerleader. He used to, creep into her bedroom. She hated it from the very moment, but couldn't do anything. Like it was kind of a classic victim abuse story. And again, I think we had read a lot of that at the time in novels in the 90s. So, Russell did allow that. But it wasn't a condition of the, I think when you option a book, you, and in all the books I've optioned, I've always made it clear that the author wouldn't have approval over the script. But on the other hand, I think it was interesting when I did Felicia's Journey with William Trevor. the producer of that, because I didn't produce that film, was surprised when I wanted to have William Trevor read it, because in his understanding there was no need to do that.
Right.
But I do feel that it's why would you not have the writer respond to your work? I mean, like it's a collaboration, and if they're welcome to it, if they're open to it, I mean, like why
not? Of course.
Why not? I mean,
why not? You spoke about the letter being one of the ghosts within The Sweet Hereafter. Are there any other ghosts within the film?
That's the most obvious one. There are the ghosts of a pre-existing structure, which, as a filmmaker, I can see that there's an internal motion to certain scenes because they're meant to be in a certain place, and so I'm seeing a vestige of that. But I don't think that's as easy to discern. You asked me something very specifically, which is holding on a face. So the question is, when you're shooting, is when you're holding on a face, the actor needs to be thinking and processing something. So that ghost is really, it came up in our conversation. I don't think, any film has the ghost, I think, of a what's called a temporary soundtrack. That is to say that there's music that you might be listening to and anticipating to use in your cut, but it's not going to be the music that you're going to use in the final version.
Right.
And there's a what's called a temp love, when filmmakers fall in love with the temporary score. And then want that, and of course it's usually not affordable, or it's like, but in this case, I had a texture that I worked on with the composer, but there was it's not really a ghost. I mean, I think the letter is
the chief ghost.
It's the chief ghost. The chief ghost.
Speaking of music, you're working on operas right now.
Yes. I mean, that's a whole other. I mean, I think these days I spend as much time with opera than with film, because I really, after Exotica, I got this opportunity to work on a production of Salome with a Canadian opera company. But around the same time, I was asked to write a libretto for an original opera by a Canadian composer, Rodney Sharman, called Elsferlis, actually set in Africa during the Rwandan genocide. And what's interesting is that it wasn't actually, when I was writing it, the Rwandan genocide hadn't begun. It was an anticipation based on kind of a story that I had made up. But by the time it was premiered, even though that it was never mentioned specifically, that's what it became about for the viewer, because we premiered it in 1995. So it was
very eerie.
Eerie indeed. Yeah. But I love opera. I mean, I think it
seems the complete opposite of the way you make films, because I'm working on an opera as well at the moment, working on the libretto.
Tell me about it.
I'm adapting my own novel, The Fortune Men, into an opera for the Royal Opera House. And it's so strange, because all of the things, I think both of us prefer subtlety to shouting out what you think and feel and want. And in opera, everything is externalized and declared, at least in the way that the tradition has been so far. Yeah. So how did you make that turn into this external?
Well, I would warn you. I mean, for instance, my first, the libretto I wrote, Elsferlis, was very challenging structurally. It was also non-linear, and it was like moving back and forth in time. It was a story of two generations of diplomats in this African country. One was an older gay couple who had been kind of banished to this country because of their relationship at the time. It wouldn't be accepted, and suddenly from this place where they were meant to be forgotten, this extraordinary violence begins to erupt, and they end up being the only couple that stays. And they're making a statement about that, and it's cutting between that time and this younger diplomatic couple, and the relationship to the master of the house, this black character who really goes through this whole revolution in his country, set against the backdrop of these two sets of outsiders. So it was very ambitious, and Yeah, but I soon realized that like you couldn't really do that with opera. Like we needed to use subtitles. We had to situate people. We had to kind of like because of the way. Yeah, I was writing it as a film script, honestly.
And did you film it?
Yeah. Oh no, not really. I mean, I did it at the time with like there's an archival recording of it, but no. I mean, I really I just directed it as because I come from theater. Before I started making films, I was doing theater, so I'm comfortable in the theatrical space, and I understand that theater is very often ephemeral, and so I didn't feel the need to record it. It had 30 different performances across the country, and by the end, I did make an archival tape. But it was also, I think, it was an eye-opener because it sort of taught me, okay, this is, and you'll find this as well. I mean, to do a new opera, many of the successful operas have been written by composers who have seen a play that works, that they then, take the rights to. Yeah, but
that line between what we feel and what we know, I think that's one of the chief dilemmas or dichotomies of the moment. Does what I feel matter more than what another person thinks that they know?
Mm. Yes, I mean, and this goes back to your very provocative question about this experience I had as a teenager, and what am I to make of that of judging the society that I was in at the time, and of course I have a very particular. As an immigrant, as someone who was introduced into this very homogenous, society, who was trying to understand the rules, I don't know if I would have given myself the privilege of deciding that something was wrong. Especially at that point, I wanted to become an artist myself. My parents were both painters. I must say that my parents were involved in a studio where her father was also involved. So they were implicated in this as well. So, and I used to kind of, I really cherished their sense of creativity. Obviously, it's something that I inherited, and it has given meaning to my life. But there was this casualty. There was this.
And it wasn't accidental that it was a young woman who was the casualty. Yeah,
exactly. So this is all stuff that, yes, I mean, it fueled a lot of feelings, and I would say I still haven't resolved it entirely. I would say the film I'm working on right now that I'm writing is still dealing with that. So I think this question of the abuse of authority is something that it comes up a lot in my work. And
is it mostly because of your friend, or is it something else?
Well, it's also I come from my background is Armenian, so there's this history of being victimized, and also in a way, as a culture, we've operated in when we were dominated, when we were sort of as a culture, we were part of the Ottoman Empire, or we were part of the Russian Empire, or before that we were part of the Persian Empire. That we've always had these munificent masters that were giving us the opportunity to do what we did, but also under fear, I suppose. And so this movement towards independence, and this movement towards, and it's still, I mean, from the recent war, I mean, we're still struggling with this issue of how do we define our independence? We are a small culture. We are actually, it's a miracle we've survived, given the hostilities directed against us. So that is also part of my upbringing, of course, as an Armenian. I'm very aware of that history.
And this is my closing question, and it's a crude one, but I think it's an important one. What is your purpose as an artist?
Well, I think to find a way of chronicling what I see and what I feel. It's a simple, I have been blessed with a sense that I've had a very unusual formation in some ways, and so that has given me a particular perspective. I've never wondered about that. I've questioned whether or not I have the talent to define what that is. And so I'm in awe of people like you who can write, because I would love to be able to have that confidence to write.
Write novels.
Yeah, I mean, the problem when I begin writing is I'm always aware that there's someone who would be able to explain this better than I, and I always feel, oh my God, if William Trevor was writing this, or if Russell Banks was writing this, or if Margaret Atwood was writing this as a Canadian, that there was that I can imagine the story would be told better. But I have to say that from the moment I began, filming, I always felt that there was a particular way I saw these relationships and these faces, as you said, that was I gave myself permission to assert my decisions. I felt that they were the right choices. I felt that if I could assemble the right team around me, the right cinematographer, the right composer, the right designers, that together, and it is a group effort, together we could make something. And I find when I'm doing opera as well, if I have the right team, and of course in that case you'll have the music already, but it just feels like I trust myself. So I think it's that when you ask what there's a way I see things, and I also give myself permission to tell those stories that particular way.
I was going to ask another question.
How about you? Let me ask you.
What's my purpose? Well, I think I started out with a very strong sense of purpose of correcting wrongs and getting my revenge, getting my family's revenge on history, even in a way. And now that's less clear. And I can be more honest and say that I'm actually trying to excavate my own traumas and griefs through these stories. So it's a personal motive or purpose rather than a more public or political one. But there is also, I think, what's important for writers who come and artists who come from places where there's been mass violence is to also remember that art is also play, and it's a place where you can be safe and unfettered and yourself.
Yeah, and create these paradigms that don't exist around you. But there is that feeling when you're younger, I think, that these sorrows that you feel can somehow be healed by like a really beautiful work of art. That if you can express something, as you said, that then those blessures, those the wounds that your family has been inflicted with, or the people that you love have been inflicted with, that they can somehow be corrected and realigned. Yes. And you realize it's not that easy, right? As you realize that at a certain point that, art doesn't do that. It makes you feel like you can do that. And it empowers the imagination to think that there might be another way. But it in itself does not, correct it, right? So I agree. Anyway.
Yeah. You can look at the wounds, you can tend to them, but you don't necessarily heal them.
Yeah. But I'm so happy to have made this contact with you, and I really and I'm dying to sort of know about your experiences with opera. And I will give you one little piece of advice: is that the composer is king, right? I mean, in a way, it's all about the music, and so at a certain point, you're going to experience that. When I work with a composer for film, I can actually I can let them know what I want, what I'm hearing, and how I'd like the instrumentation to be, and how I'd like the music to be modulating, or all that stuff is within my
purview.
Very much so, but I can't. When you're working in opera,
you step back.
You need to at a certain point. So
that could be nice. With a novel, you are everything to the novel, and it'd be quite nice to be able to step back.
Do you have a relationship with the composer? I mean,
I do. By some coincidence, we went to university together.
Okay.
20 years ago, and she got it. We started working in university 3 years ago. The same day, we recognized each other across the auditorium, stayed in touch, and she invited me to work with her on this.
Right. Who was the composer?
Her name is Nina Whiteman.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, sure. Great.
You know her?
Yeah, well, I know the music. I know her music.
Okay, fantastic.
That's great.
Yeah. So we're hoping to use lots of industrial sounds.
Yeah.
She does lots of electronic music.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. That's great.
Yes. I'll keep in touch with you about that.
Yeah, please. I mean, I've got your email, so I'll sort of connect with you right after we finish this.
Yeah.
Okay?
I can send you a proof of the novel as well, if you like.
Oh, yeah. I'd love that. Okay.
Okay.
Well,
fantastic.
What a pleasure.
It has been. Well done.
I hope next time you watch one of my films, the sound is working properly.
It was. I watched it with the real sound, and it was.
But you were a little disappointed, right?
No. The first time with the blurry sound, I was in that mood for blurry sound.
Well, I'll tell you, when I sent my second feature to the Berlin Film Festival, they played it on the wrong video system. So they saw it in black and white, and they chose the film based on the black and white version. And they were decidedly unimpressed with the fact that it was in color. And they told me that they preferred it in black and white. And I thought, like,
Germans are very honest.
Yes.
They won't sugarcoat things.
No, it was horrifying. So anyway. But it's good to know that you have no power to go back to my film Sweet Hereafter and demand that the sound be.
And Ararat. That's my next one. Ararat.
Okay. Well, a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.